Hi, I am Marty Smith, half of this dynamic duo. I was raised in Indiana, so my early experience was with Western Yearly Meeting growing up in that part of the country. We moved to New Jersey about 30 years ago, more than that, gosh, 40 years ago, where we became immersed in unprogrammed Quakerism, which was in Moorestown Meeting, which is our meeting currently. In the meantime, I have traveled with Bill. Bill and I have traveled recently with Friends World Committee of Consultation, traveled in the ministry, where we went around to several meetings within Friends United meeting. This was 3 years ago. And now we're here and delighted to be at Barnegat today to talk about Christ and Jesus as in the history of Quakers and modern times.
I'm Bill Smith. I grew up in Ohio, Indiana, Jamaica, and Ohio. Then went to college and graduate school and everything else. My father was a Quaker pastor who very much, wherever he went, made people aware what Quakers were historically, so that he stayed in places only long enough to get the congregation being able to run themselves. The only problem with that is almost everywhere he went, when he left, there were 200 or 300 people attending worship. And I recently went to one of the meetings that he pastored, and there were 6 people there on Sunday morning, mainly because they asked me to come and speak in remembrance of my father. So I went to graduate school, and at one point in my life, my local meeting in Ohio proposed that I become a recorded minister. I was preparing to be a high school teacher at the time. And some people said, and I said, I don't particularly want to do that. But they said, please go ahead and do that and let it go through the process. So my local meeting proposed me, my quarterly meeting proposed me, and I was proposed at the yearly meeting level to be a recorded minister. They turned me down because I wasn't going to be a pastor. I was going to be a teacher. And what that did was some of the people who wanted me to be there, they were just testing that to see whether that you could record a minister who wasn't a paid pastor. But anyway, so I went on in biology. We moved to New Jersey and we got involved in what I learned about was that there was a division between these things called Hicksites and Orthodox. I always thought it was Wilburites and Gurneyites that were the separation. Because I grew up, that was the separation that was important to the people of my family and way back. And I because I got that difference, I became interested in looking at Quaker history and seeing how these things came about. Why are they what they are? And so I spent a lot of time doing reading Quaker history. And I started doing Quakerism 101 in Philadelphia, the early meeting, and that kind of thing. And we split this apart because my particular interest is the historical Friends. But you can't be historical without seeing where we are today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do up to the first few years of the 20th century and talk about what it was. Now, being 79 years, 80 years old, sorry.
80, you reached 80.
Yeah, I'm in my 81st year. I had a grandmother who gained years because she kept saying, well, I'm in my 76th year. And then the next birthday, she said, well, I'm 77. And so I'm, now I'm in my 78th year. And she gained a couple of years in her life. So I do things that I don't necessarily remember things, like my thumb drive, USB is in my other shirt. My wife didn't let me wear it because it's the middle part is a little tight. So we're not doing PowerPoint, but PowerPoints are just words anyway. So if we think about when Quakerism started, in the recent years, probably the last 20 years, there has been a major academic group called Quaker Studies. It actually starts basically in England. And so they're really looking at the history of Quakerism and what it is today, and an academic way. A lot of PhD students at the University of Birmingham and the University of Leicester both have graduate programs. They were affiliated with Woodbrook, but Woodbrook has now become a virtual on. It's not you don't go to Woodbrook anymore. It's still there, but it's now part of the historic trust of the community. The buildings are. So those people have been doing a lot of study. And one of the things is that we normally think in terms of Quaker history, we think of George Fox's journal as the best early history. What people doing Quaker studies have found is they look at the other literature. There were lots of other things that were written at the same time as George Fox. And a lot of them have something a little different than Fox. You got to remember the Fox journal was not published until he was dead. And he didn't start writing it until he had quit traveling. And so that particular thing is a remembrance of what Fox thinks went on. The important thing is we do have, and was read in meeting this morning, a passage from the journal that says, Fox said he had been going all over England trying to find an answer to his spiritual problems. He didn't feel like he fit into anything that it was. And at one point he comes to the conclusion that none of the people today can help him, and that the only help would be from Christ Jesus that could speak to his condition. And so that becomes something that's really important. The only thing that passage doesn't say is what George Fox equated Christ Jesus to was the light. So that there are a number of people who have written about Fox's opinion of the light, and the light happens to be Christ Jesus, or the Christ. Now, early Quakers did not spend any major time, talking about the historical Jesus. They were excited about the experience they were having of the Christ, the light, the inward light. You'll never find inner light in Fox or any of the earlier writings, because the light is not something that is your personal little thing inside you. It is something that's coming from the outside, and something that's been there since the beginning, according to the first chapter of Genesis. Because there was light before there was a moon and stars and all of those. So there was this light that is people you could tap into. You can sit and listen and get messages and get information and get a way to move on. Now, this is happening. The first Friends were happening when there was, first off, there was a civil war. which is partly religious, because a lot of the people were against the state church, the Church of England, which taxed everybody for the tithes that maintained their local church and their local clergymen, who may have been a hireling from somebody owned the parish, an earl or somebody owned the parish, and they would then employ somebody to be the hireling clergy, the person in the thing. So during that time, there was all of this tumult. Okay. And in fact, a historian wrote a book called Turn the World Upside Down about that particular period of time. So these people were really thinking in terms of what's going to happen, and we're going to experience the light, Christ, which is an eternal kind of thing. And now the words cosmic Christ and universal Christ and all of that are used by a lot of theologians and other people writing. The early Quakers were talking about this a long time ago. The first generation was really excited. Fox and others go to the north of England. They spend a number of years, Fox and other people, trying to do things in what's the Midlands, the middle part of England. And they decided they would move north. And they moved north, and Fox, walking along, decided to climb a hill. If you've ever tried to climb Pendle Hill, you know that it's a fairly tedious climb. And in fact, now it's all sheep territory. Then it was all brambles and other things. And nobody went out hiking and climbing hills in those days unless they were a little touched in the head. So Fox decided he'd climb Pendle Hill. The guy with him didn't. Fox goes to the top and looks around and gets a vision of people dressed in white gathered together. Now, when we were there, the guide said that then Fox and Farnworth, when he went down, Farnworth went down, they went to the local pub and had a few drinks. And he had a vision of these people in white and things. So, but his whole point was that there was going to be, he began to feel that there would be a gathering of people, a following. And so he then goes to Thedberg, and Thedberg is a place where lots of, at that particular time of the year, there is a labor market there for, I can't remember what they are, but they all dressed in white. And so he came into this town with all these people dressed in white and felt this was, you know, here's the place. So he gets up in a tree in the churchyard and begins to preach, and people come around, and the tree's still there, by the way. Then later he goes out to where they're, and there is a group called the Seekers, but they weren't really a group. They were all over England. There were groups that got together that said, what the church is doing now isn't what we want to do, and we're seeking something else. So they would just go and sit in silence, and somebody then would speak. And typically it was the same person. So they really kind of had a minister kind of thing, but they weren't. And they were meeting on Furbank Fell. Now, only when I went to Furbank Fell did I realize fells are mountains. And you go up the top of Furbank Fell, and today there's a brick fence, a stone fence around an area. There used to be a chapel in there, a building in there. And some of the Seekers were there, and Halgill was speaking, and Fox comes and meets outside, stays outside, they leave, and they dismiss the meeting they were having, and they come outside, and Fox gets up on a local rock and preaches. And Fox says in his journal that there were 1,000 people there. I have real difficulty thinking about somebody speaking to 1,000 people from Iraq and they could hear. He must have had an amplifier or something, or a big voice, right? It could be. And there were a number of people that were convinced from what Fox was saying. And what he was saying was that Christ has come to teach his people himself. We don't need rites. We don't need clergy. We don't need, all we need to do is to all of us search, listen for the light of Christ. And a number of people were convinced by that. And a couple of years later, the Valiant 60 take off. Now, Valiant 60 is the number that Fox says because it parallels something in the New Testament. When Jesus sends the people out 2 by 2, he sends 60 2 by 2. So Fox says we sent 60, right? Well, we know it's probably more like 100 that went out rather than 60. And they went out 2 by 2s. And they went all over England. And at that time, they went to some really far places. They went out to Istanbul. They went to Boston. But before they went to North America, they went to the Caribbean. And so people in Jamaica love to say Fox came to us before they came to you. So the early meeting there says, you know, we're longer. The early meeting isn't older than the early meeting, but Fox was there very early. And so it became very, very popular. I mean, there at some time in England, there is estimated there was 50,000 Quakers, members of Friends, the Society of Friends. Then the Commonwealth quits. I don't know how much English history you know, but the Commonwealth under Cromwell disappears and Charles II becomes king again. So you have a restoration. Quakers were having a good time during the Commonwealth because Commonwealth didn't do things like censor religion, or they really were anti-Church of England. So they really, all of these other little groups got an opportunity to really take off. When Charles II took over, he came in and talked about tolerance. Well, Quakers and others found that tolerance to not be very tolerant. And in fact, the Parliament actually passed a Quaker Act, which in fact didn't say Quakers can't worship, but it said, described the worship of Quakers and said, this is against the law. And so they could not meet. There were a number of convectile, and it took me a long time to learn what a convectile is. It just means a religious meeting. And so they had all kinds of rules about who could and who couldn't, because they were reestablishing the Church of England as the state and only church in England. And so prosecution began, and Quakers got putting in prison and all kinds of things. And at that point in time, there popped up what is typically called the second generation Friends. People like Penn and Barclay and Keith, who were all three trained in theology. And so therefore they began to write, well, Penn was educated, but not necessarily in theology. But all the, you got to remember that Cambridge and Oxford were theological schools. They were where you trained your ministers and your clergy. So at that point in time, so that they began to write much more apologies. For instance, we have Barclay's Apology for True Christianity, which became the Bible for Quakers for generations after that. I don't know how many of you have read or looked at Quakers. It's a good idea. If you want to read the apology, do not read the Barclay's Apology in modern English. I've read studies of that showing the translations from the Barclay's words to modern English has some bias to it. Right? So it's not really saying exactly what the same thing is. It reads much better than Barclay's apology, which is 17th century English, which is not as bad as some of the 18th, 19th century English, but it's wordy. Right? Okay, so those began to have a much more established kind of religion for Quakers. If you heard the Barnegat meeting thing earlier on that I did about faith and practices, you'll notice that there were faith and practice. There was very much loose at the beginning, and then they began to say we need to kind of we need to tie things up a little bit, make it a little tighter about what we are. And so Barclay's apology becomes a thing. Penn wrote a number of things. Keith happens to be an interesting character because he later became the Episcopal missionary to West Jersey and to convert Quakers to the Episcopal Church. I used to meet at the Episcopal bishop's house in Trenton, and on the fire mantle place was a picture of the saints of South Jersey Episcopal. One of them was George Keith, but he was a very strong and very prominent member who went with Penn and Fox and other people to travel to Europe and other places at one point in time. But he then felt that Quakers were not organized enough and not Christian enough. So the question about whether Quakers are Christian or not depends upon what your definition of Christian is. If your definition of Christian is that people believe in something that's transcendent, it's beyond the physical, the natural world, that can speak to us and can help us in our way, then they're Christians. If you call that thing Christ. Early Quakers were not Trinitarian, and in fact, the horror of Babylon is what Penn called the Trinity. So anyway, so therefore they began to get Barclay and all of those kinds of things. Then you move into all of the early friends die. And a lot of them, because they were in prison, they were beaten, there were all kinds of things. So they didn't actually live to very old age, but a lot of the earlier ones died off. And so they were no longer writing or no longer carrying that exciting message that Christ has come to teach people himself. So what happens is you begin to have, and this happens through the whole of the 18th century, that's 1700s, the 18th century, Quakers become much more involved in what do you do, not what you believe. They're members of a meeting and they hear people speak, give messages, and there's widespread traveling ministers and people like John Woolman and other people travel around and present stuff. So, but theologically, there's not much change. However, they become very involved in what are you doing? What is your discipline? And Penn called it the cross of discipline. And that is, what do you do in your daily life? Do you use the plain language? Do you not marry outside the Quakerism? that's so the children will be raised Quaker. If you marry somebody who's not a Quaker, then your family isn't going to be Quaker. And therefore, you're going to have people get outside. A little metaphor they used is we need to build a hedge around our society so that we're separate, we're peculiar, we're odd, we are trying to be different. And so what happens is they begin to read people out of meeting. You were drunk last Friday, right? We no longer associate with you. You are no longer somebody we want to say is a Quaker because you're not behaving properly. Now, if that person then came back and said, I'm really sorry, I won't do it again. They said, okay, you can come back in. It wasn't a matter of shunning like the Amish do. It was a matter of saying, you've done things we don't want people to say, that's what Quakers do. Right? So that became, and there are 2 or 3 studies that people have done where they've gone through and seen how many things were for drunk, how much were outside, going outside, and in the middle of the 18th century, or towards the end, you have the Revolution, the American Revolution. And there are a number of Quakers who joined the Revolution. And they were read out of the meeting because they weren't following the peace testimony, or the testimony against war is what it was at the time. And so therefore, and a number of those people began to meet together, and a little teeny group became the Free Quakers. The only way that's prominent today is the Free Quaker Meeting House is on the Independence Mall in Philadelphia. And it quickly dissolved. Well, the other thing that's important about that meeting house is Betsy Ross was the last person worshiping in that meeting house. So anyway, so in that time, you're really talking about something that's talk about really firming up and tightening up and having, getting smaller, but not really small because it's a very tight group. And it's a very, my grandfather was Quaker, my father's Quaker, I'm Quaker. And so you're really important. And so you have a place like Moorestown, which the town is basically Quaker. And now that's not true anymore, but it used to be. I mean, anyway, so you have that kind of tightness together. Well, things are happening in the 1800s. There's things called the First Great Awakening, where people became really involved in religion and in evangelical religion, basically Methodism, and John Wesley. And so you begin to have people really getting excited about that. The other thing that's happening at that time is something called the Enlightenment, which is the development of science. And those kinds of things begin to happen. So you have people opening up to be, quotes, liberal, which means that you're open to other ideas. And then there's the other side, which is people who are conservative, which means we're not open to new ideas. What we have is what we're going to keep. And that friction becomes very evident in the Philadelphia area first. And so those two things, the tightness, the discipline, and the fact where we're looking at things and saying, wait a minute, let's think about that, right? And that comes to a head at Arch Street Meeting House, and when they have a real debate about who's going to be clerk. And the establishment city people, the wealthy Quakers from the urban areas, decided that they wanted the same clerk. And the vast majority of the people wanted another clerk. And so they couldn't come to unity. And therefore, Quaker practice is if you can't come to unity, then you keep what you have. And so they kept the same clerk. And what happened is a group of people then said, well, they'd say nasty things today, but whatever they were saying in that day, they'd say, you know, tough, right? And they all walked out and went to Green Street. That's the beginning of the Hicksite movement. And the Hicksite movement has very little to do with Elias Hicks. It has to do with the fact that with the way he was treated. When he came to Philadelphia to speak, he'd sit on the speakers, the minister sat on the facing bench. He'd sit on the facing bench, and at one meeting, the people next to him refused to shake his hand at the end of the meeting. And did all kinds of things to say, you know, whatever. Now, this is a well-established traveling minister who's late in life and was treated as if, and the point was, he kind of wanted back to where you were talking about the blood being the atonement. And in fact, at one point he said something about, you know, the blood of Christ is about as good as the blood of a goat, which today almost everybody would agree. Anywhere in the anything left of the far right would say, oh yeah, that's that, you know, it's not blood that saves everybody. It's something else. I mean, whatever. Don't want to get into the theology that way. But so you had this split, right? That they both used exactly the same faith and practice to begin with. No, one group called it the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, and the other one called it the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Faith and Practice. There were two Philadelphia Yearly Meetings in 18, 28, 27, 28, 28. So much that PowerPoint would have to tell me which dates they're doing. But anyway, at that point, what happened between yearly meetings was that a yearly meeting writes an epistle, and they send the epistle to other Quaker yearly meetings. You get your New York yearly meeting. You get two epistles, both from Philadelphia yearly meeting. Which one do you accept? Well, in New York, Ohio, New England, they began to say, okay, well, we need to accept. Well, they ended up having one group accepting one and one group accepting the other. So after 1828, other yearly meetings began to divide into Hicksite and Orthodox. Orthodox does not mean Orthodox Quakers. Orthodox means Orthodox Christians. They were following an Orthodox Christian form of theology. Hicksite doesn't mean you're following Hicks. It just means you're not the Orthodox and you don't want to follow their particular thing, which means it opens up for all kinds of other things to be dealt with. Right? So in other words, you're not very strict. You're starting out with the same kind of theology, but you're saying we're not bound by that. So it's a much opener. It's also people who are, some people feel it's urban and rural. It's some of that, but you're talking about farmers when you're talking about the meetings. And farmers tend to be much more open to doing different kinds of things back then. Today, I think farmers are the other way around, but that's partly because they're losing their land. But anyway, so you have the Hicksite and Orthodox division, and that doesn't occur anywhere else in the world. It's only in North America. And that goes on then a few years, and your Hicksites really kind of just evolved and developed until, and Marty's going to talk about the Hicksite yearly meetings, which were the 7 yearly meetings. They never organized. They had some conferences, but they really didn't pull together because they were 7 individual yearly meetings with 7 yearly, with bunches of individual yearly monthly meetings in them. And so and then they developed into FGC. So FGC current is a conference that attended by what used to be the.
I think the time has come.
Well, just a minute. Now. Anyway, the side that's fun is the Orthodox side. And the Orthodox, actually, what they do is very quickly, there's a banker from England called Joseph John Gurney, who comes to America and travels around in a very fancy carriage and matched horses, and goes around and preaches in Orthodox Quaker meeting houses. And Joseph John Gurney is all of London yearly meeting became what we would call today evangelical. And they began working with the Church of England and other kind of denominations to do good works. And so he traveled around and really was much more Orthodox Christian than even what a lot of the Quakers were. And he spoke to Congress, and he very much of an impact. And so the Orthodox then became split between what became called Gurneyites, who were much more Orthodox, and eventually ended up with pastors and all kinds of things. And then you had Wilburites, that John Wilbur traveled around behind Gurney and preached against him, or he wrote epistles to people saying, this is not what we want. Right? So the Wilburites were more conservative in terms of their Quakerism. And today, there were a large number of Wilburite yearly meetings or monthly meetings. But today there's only one, and that's the only Ohio yearly meeting, which is now called Ohio Yearly Meeting Conservative. Anyway, I'll let Marty talk. So, there are a number of books you can read about that.
Long time. But honey, but it might be really good if they might have questions before I go ahead, because
Are we recording this and putting it up on YouTube?
We're recording it, but we have no one to do editing for us, so we've got this huge backlog of things to put it on YouTube. If you know anybody who'd like to edit for us, I'm the person to talk to.
I'll think about that, because some of the folks from Haddonfield, I told them I was coming here, and there's real interest in all of it.
that's good.
Okay.
There's no control of the volume here.
We can put our camera a little closer. Somebody said they were having a little trouble hearing, and I raised it as far as I could on my end, and the microphone's in the camera. But can you just?
Yeah, if you'll guide me.
Yeah, no, it's going to be in my way. Perfect. Go ahead and good, perfect. Okay, so we're closer now, and I think the volume should be better. I'm too far away. I'll be wrong.
Are there any questions for Bill, the historical part, before I go?
Yes, I have one. Now, the Hicks was from Hicksville, Long Island. Is that where that started, or no?
Yeah, Hicks's farm was on Long Island. Yeah, he was a farmer. I think Hicksville is the family name.
Yeah.
So it's, that's, and of course, then he had a peaceable king who was drawn by his cousin.
So
Yep.
What I've read a little bit about the history of the Quakers is quite interesting, but from my understanding, they were trying to break away, like Foxman was breaking away from the established religious organizations of that day. And so when Gurney comes along, it seems like they're trying to reinstitute what Fox tried to break away from, and that I think Gurney was a Presbyterian minister or a minister.
No, he was a prominent Quaker.
But before he came up to Quaker, I thought he was a minister.
No,
or
his
he was
family
belonged
is-
to another-
His family is long-term Quakers, and they are the ones who started Barclay Bank.
Mhm.
And he was a banker and was lifelong Quaker.
But he was bringing back in the institution that Fox was trying to break away from, the structure that Fox was trying to break away from. correct?
All of London yearly meeting, the British yearly meeting, which is now called the yearly meeting of Britain. They were moving that direction, that the whole thing was moving to that direction. And since I didn't get to talk about the 1890 conference. No, and then a bunch of young Quakers in London yearly meeting put together a conference to say, we need to go back to the early Quakers. And so things shifted back towards the early Quakers. And then things moved to the London yearly meeting from that away, yeah. But Gurney was a well-established Quaker minister. But he was a banker, that's where he could retire early so he could travel.
Can you show us the different things of beliefs of the two groups? Exciting.
Okay, John Coles, who's a third or fourth generation Quaker, and is at Mount Laurel. He says the Hicksites twiddled their thumbs right to left, and the Orthodox twiddled it left to right.
That's not true.
What I'm saying is there was very little theological difference between the two groups. There was a whole lot of social angst between the two groups, but theologically, particularly in the early, when you're talking about before they split, they really weren't discussing different theological things. It was much more an authoritarian kind of thing. In other words, there was a group of rural people who said, we don't want the city folks dictating to us. And then, of course, when they split, the one group that was wanting to be part of the establishment in the cities and urban areas, then became more that way. And now in Philadelphia, they never had a split between the Wilburites and the Orthodox. It was, the Orthodox was one, Wilburite and Gunnerite was just one. And so Philadelphia meeting, when it came time to organize, went with the French General Conference. So it's not, the Orthodox, the Orthodox never went with any of the organizations with the Gurneyites. So it's an interesting history, Philadelphia, which is different than others. Yep.
Yeah, I was reading about splits and around here, Little Lake Harbor, between the Orthodox and the Hicksites, there was a split. I think part of it had to do with the town people and the country people. And it seemed to me that the Orthodox were more, had a greater tendency to read people out, while the Hicksites were much more open and tolerant. Is that how you see it? Is that what happened?
Well, after the split, there weren't many disownments. I mean, disownments were in the 1700s, the big disownments.
or you read somebody out.
Yeah. Yeah, so the 19th century, disownment wasn't a big deal. I would think that, if you were going to compare the two, I would say the Orthodox, if they were dealing with a fairly Orthodox viewpoint, would have had more disownments than others, but the disownments weren't permanent. Disownment was, what we're saying is, we're saying what you're doing, we don't want to be associated with a Quaker. So therefore we're gonna say you're not a Quaker.
But if you go out and get drunk one night, that's you read out of the meeting or something like that.
If you're drunk every Friday night, you would be.
Yeah, it's behavior.
Yeah, no, yes.
That's all your behavior.
Yeah. Because Quakers very much believe that if you have an inward experience, it will show outside. It's not just something that happens and you go to heaven. It's something that changes your life. You're gonna follow the wake of the practices that people are showing you. The love, the care, the responsibility, those kinds of things. And it's not what you believe as much as it is what you do.
A person who sees that of God in others and behaves that for them.
Well, it's not the fact of God in others. God is in everything. The
Yeah,
light
God
is light is in everything. Light is there, and it's not saying God is everything.
No.
Okay, it's just that there is the other thing they talked about was a seed. There is a seed in everyone. So everybody can be good. That means original sin isn't true, which jumps you out of Orthodox Christianity.
The behaviors that are not consistent with the idea of that in God and everything.
Or you're giving the Quakers a bad name, so
Yeah.
go away.
That-
We don't, and they actually posted it on the meeting house door, is that this person is no longer represents Quakers.
So we take it from who gets, so we know what that person did. Uh-oh, better not do that.
Or Quakers who don't do that. But disownment was never for a particular belief kind of thing. The big one, a lot of people were disowned for were marrying outside Quakers.
We also had a member read out for training with a militia.
Oh. Mhm,
He and his brother both.
mhm.
One individual's here in the graveyard, so he seems to have reconciled later.
Well, the first commandant of the Marines is buried at Arch Street. And he was read out, but he was also after the Revolutionary War, he came back and he said, "I'm sorry, I won't do it again."
I think I'm gonna go ahead for the modern times, if you don't mind. I know those questions could go on for quite a while.
We have one coming on.
Oh, okay.
Okay, this is related to Buddhist theology, Bill. The question is, are you familiar with Buddhist theology? Because it seems like George Fox and a lot of traditional Quaker theologians, if not the Orthodox, is treating, quote, the Christ, something like the Buddha nature, an eternal indwelling principle, as opposed to discussing much of Jesus or Siddhartha, the historical man.
Yeah. Now, George Fox wouldn't have known what Buddhism was. But the concepts are very, very close, very close. So it's a matter of thinking in terms of, in modern, I'm going to steal Marty's thunder here. in terms of modern times, that's the way things are really looked at in. Anyway, the liberal branch of Quakerism is that it's a universal spirit. And at one point in time, there was a man in Galilee who was filled with this eternal spirit, this universal spirit, and fully enough for him to be called the Messiah. Same thing's true with Buddhism. And in Buddhism, as like in early Quakers, people can become the Buddha. All right, I can become the Buddha because it's not a single person in history. It's the person who becomes filled with the Buddha spirit. Yeah, and so, anyway, so yeah, that's and that's what Universalist Quakers are proposing. Right? They're saying that this is a universal spirit. It's not just tied to Jesus.
Yeah.
It's tied to something that's an eternal spirit.
That's a good segue. That's a very good segue. He really, it's a good example, such a good example. And in my personal feeling, there are many prophets that have come to people within different religions, within different environments. And Jesus, you could say, is our prophet, the one we follow. So there are many, many prophets, Buddha being one, people within Hinduism. And so that's more of a universalist emphasis upon following the light, seeking the light and finding it in many, many places. So I will begin by telling you about the more modern Quakers, which I'm going to say is the 20th and the 21st century. There was a conference in the 1970s in St. Louis, which was an amalgam of 35 friends from 24 yearly meetings and associations in the United States. They came together to look at the future of Friends at that point. They were going to look at the future, but also say, what do we have in common as all these Quakers? During their time together, they leveled with one another rather than keeping the differences underneath the rug. And what this morphed into was something called a Faith and Life panel of 9 friends, 5 of whom wrote a pamphlet that I used as a reference for what I'm doing today, called Quaker Understanding of Christ and of Authority. And the interesting thing about this pamphlet is up in the upper right hand corner is my father's name. This was his booklet as he was studying and learning about Quakerism. He later became a Quaker pastor in Western Yearly Meeting, and he was studying this pamphlet at the time. And it was edited by T. Canby Jones at that point, who is somebody I have admired and respected his writing. He's no longer with us. But that was the basis of what I'm going to talk about today. So what they found out, this group of people that met together, was that there were 2 streams emerging among Quakers. And they were, one, the Universalist stream that Bill just talked about and really described quite beautifully. They called it the Universalist Humanist stream that had become visible or viable in the 20th century. And that particular stream talked about the inner light, the seed, that of God in every man. And this stream was informed by or inspired by the first chapter of John, verse 9. The whole chapter of John actually, or the whole Gospel of John, is actually called the Quaker Gospel. I don't know if you've heard that before, but it is something that I refer to often. I love the first 8 verses particularly, almost have them memorized, but not quite. But this is the 9th verse that they use as an inspiration. Also, they used the Universalist, something that John Woolman spoke about in his pamphlet and what he preached about. And it said, there is a principle which is pure, placed in the human mind, which in different places and ages have different names. It is, however, pure and proceeds from God. It is deep and inward, confined to no forms of religion, nor excluded from any. Where the heart stands in perfect sincerity, it is in whomever this takes root and grows, of what nation soever, they became brethren in the best sense of the expression. Written by John Woolman, who actually traveled among native people during his time when he was alive and sought out that commonality with the native peoples, and he found it, not surprisingly. And that was one tradition that was emerging, and of course, the same tradition, the same faith stream, the Christocentric or biblical stream. And that had been here all along, as you know, from the beginning. The emphasis in that stream was on the inward and experiential appropriation thereof. In other words, you could come to that through your inward experience of the light. That's how it came to you. Let's see. And I'm going to repeat something that Bill said, that the early friends were intoxicated with the sense that of this great spiritual energy, which they felt, and it was the same as that inspired by Jesus, who had come to teach the people himself. An example of this universalist, well, I'm just going to leave it at that. I think Bill gave a good example of that universalist stream that had become to be quite obvious within Quakerism in the 1970s, certainly. And what I have done is taken the major branches that were in existence, that had come into existence at that time within Quakerism. There were 4 of them. One of them was Friends United Meeting, which at that time had 50,000 members in the US and Canada, and then another 100,000 in other places in the world. They were both programmed and unprogrammed. And this is what they said in their faith statement as an association. That we gather into fellowship where Christ Jesus is known, loved and obeyed as the teacher and Lord. I actually grew up in Western Yearly Meeting, which was one of many yearly meetings associated with Friends United Meeting at that time. I grew up in that meeting. Western Yearly Meeting had as their faith statement that we seek the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and we equip Friends Meetings in the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we encourage ministry and the release of gifts of leadership. One of the things that FUM does even today is try to, shall we say, grow churches, to grow the spirit, to grow ministers within their association, and recognize the gifts of leadership. They do that in the US, but they do it particularly in Africa and East Africa, Central Africa, and South America, Central and South America. So that's what I grew up in, with preachers, with a preacher in meetings where I grew up. And I came to Quakerism because of my experience. I was not a Quaker until I was a teenager, when I encountered Quakers at a camp where I worked. I worked at Quaker camps for 3 summers. And during those summers, I met these incredible Quaker leaders, ministers, pastors within that setting. And that convinced me to be a friend. So that's how I came to Quakerism. That's Friends United meeting. Then we have Friends General Conference, which is another large grouping today as well. They have about 30,000 friends, mostly liberal and unprogrammed. 14 yearly meetings are affiliated currently with Friends General Conference. And this is what they say in their purpose statement. We're based on expectant waiting for the direct leading of the inner light or the Christ within. It's what they say. And the unprogrammed Friends General Conferences that I know, the yearly meetings are predominantly along the East Coast, but there are pockets of them in the Midwest and in the West. So we have them all over the US, but they're prominently in our part of the world, mostly unprogrammed friends. So when I came, having grown up a Quaker from teenagehood in Indiana, in Western, when I came here in the early 80s, I became immersed in Moorestown Friends Meeting, an open program meeting, and I had a really hard time getting used to sitting for a long period of time and waiting for the spirit to move. It just took, it was quite an adjustment to me to do that. But another adjustment was I had to be kind of careful what I said if I stood and spoke. I tried to be a little bit more careful because you understand I came from a Christ kind of Jesus Christ kind of environment where you said those words freely because you'd experienced the presence of Jesus or the Christ in your life, but you had to be very careful how you said that within meeting. That was true when I first came, no longer true. I can do that freely.
And that's about you. That's not about the people around you.
Well, originally I thought it was more about the people around me. Now I know it's about me. So it was an adjustment. I now know the people in my congregation really well. And I know that there's a lot of people who call themselves Christian besides me within my congregation. They just don't talk about it a lot. Okay, and that's right. And by the way, I would say I call myself a Christian because of what I experienced growing up. It's all about experience and the people that I have met. Okay, so that's the context in which I say that. And then we have Evangelical Friends Church International, which is the other big group right now within the US, but it's also bigger than here. It's big in Central and South America, as well as in Africa and other parts of the world. But it's quite big. It consists of 6 yearly meetings in the United States that are part of this amalgam. And they're drawn together, they say, they're drawn together by a clear commitment to Jesus Christ and a common desire to change local and international worlds for Christ. They have a strong scriptural basis, which follows George Fox's view that the scripture is to be read, believed, and fulfilled. They hold to the basic beliefs of other evangelical Christians, but generally do not observe the outward sacraments like water baptism. But don't some of them still do that? You know? Anyway.
Yes, I know, yeah.
Okay. All right, and the other large group are conservative friends. Large, well, other grouping of friends, and they number about 1,600 in the US. There consists of a small number of meetings in Iowa, Ohio, and North Carolina. They worship in silence and have explicitly Christ-centered theology. And they say that they have a balance between relying on the inner light, identifying the historical Jesus as the eternal Christ. They commit to mending the world, and they focus on evangelizing the Quaker revelation. Recently, I would say 3 years ago, in my traveling ministry, I was with conservative friends in North Carolina, in Greenville, I think it Greenville, North Carolina. No, it was actually Greenville, I think, which is to the east of Greensboro. No, it's not. It's yes, it's in that neck of the woods, actually. Isn't it north?
No, it's, Wilson, Rocky Mount, Raleigh, Goldsboro is in between that
Oh, okay.
section. And then,
Goldsboro's to the east there on
yeah,
the coast.
it's in,
Okay,
middle of the 95 straight down, you're coming close to Goldsboro.
okay. His dad used to be a pastor at Goldsboro once upon a time. We traveled there a lot. It's got a new name. It's not Friends anymore. Right? Anyway,
I've been there, that's why.
you've been there. Okay, well, you know the neck of the woods.
I'm from there.
So anyway, I went to meet with these conservative friends. They asked me to come and speak. And I talked at that group with them about the future of Quakerism. But I was just so moved and so drawn in by that group, small group, 12, 15 people, and they don't meet every Sunday. They meet, like a couple times a month or something like that, and they move around. But I was really impressed by the depth of their seeking, the depth of their worship, but also their activism. Kind of an interesting combination of the two things. My
Conservative friends aren't conservative politically.
not
They're very liberal.
They're very. And my other experience with conservative, honestly, if I was to be reborn again today, I would like to be reborn a conservative Quaker. And that's based on my experience with my best friend's mother, who had a funeral in Indiana. I saw where she worshiped for many years. She was an extraordinary person. And she was a Wilburite. So anyway, that's kind of a segue, but I'm really drawn to conservative friends. And they don't usually wear the plain clothes, put it that way. Occasionally they do, but
When I was in high school in the 50s, I went down to southeastern Ohio, in the Barnesville area, which was the center of conservative friends. And some of the Quakers were driving a horse and wagon, and they wore the plain clothes and did the plain speech. They don't do that anymore in that area, but conservative friends were conservative Quakers, but not politically.
it's just a fascinating combination of all the elements of Quakerism that I'm really drawn to and that have meaning for me.
Anyway,
So, and moving along to Philadelphia yearly meeting, of which many of us are members at this point. And it actually it is affiliated with FGC these days. And I'm particularly familiar with Philadelphia yearly meeting because for 11 years, I worked for the Friends. I was their religious ed director for that number of years. And that took me around to nearly all of the Quaker meetings in the Delaware Valley, where I would worship with them and work with their teachers in those meetings. And quite a variety within Philadelphia yearly meeting, as you might imagine, among the more Christocentric Friends and the more universalist leaning Quakers. Plus you have the other one, the Buddhist friends. We have people who are agnostics. We have atheists among friends. We have the non-theists among friends. So we have quite a variety. So the trick is trying to find a way, particularly when you're going to meet with them and speak with them, to reach the center, the inside, the deepest place with all people gathered, to get to the truth, to find the truth among. So it's a trick, and it's tricky, and I learned a lot during that time with those Quakers. Here's what they say, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. The Religious Society of Friends is a community of faith based on an experience of a transforming power, which is named in many ways: the inner light, the Spirit of Christ, the guide, the living God, or the divine presence. I use the term creator when I speak it. We speak of it. If we are able to name the other, we give it many names. For generations of friends, membership has been an outward side of the inward experience of Christ. And they follow that by saying the true light, which gives light to everyone. John 1:9. Again, they're quoting that verse in John that Quakers like to do. So in conclusion, the conclusion based on my reading of this, which was the revelation to me. This was written a long time ago. I don't even think it's even in print anymore.
What is it date from?
It is not, you know what, there's no date of publication in here, so I'm guessing it's 73 or 74, 1973. And it was originally written by FWCC,
No, it was
published by them, long time ago. But a friend in this booklet, a British friend, this he actually wrote in 1972. He said, we must learn of Quakerism as the tension rather than a choice between two points of view. Those who approach truth in terms of Christian tradition and those who approach truth in general or universal terms. The two poles, his name is Greenwood. Greenwood said the two poles are complementary aspects of the Christ to whom we witness, that true light who enlightens all men. Oh, honestly, I have to say this right. This is 1:9. This is when John the Baptist is talking about witnessing to this man whom he baptized. He said, this is the man who was coming into the world. How should we say it? That true light who enlightens all men was coming into the world. That's exactly what John 1:9 said, which is inconsistent with what I said.